Welcome back, Source Nation. You're listening live to Mailbox Sundays with your hosts, Dr. Terry Jackson, Life Coach Tim T., and Pastor Kenny Smith.
Source Nation, welcome back. As I stated before, we have a special guest with us tonight, Dr. Rowman Robertson, and we're going to be talking about an extremely important topic, personal development, the impact of ethnocentrism on the development of the African-American male. And I look forward to this discussion. Dr. Robertson, how are you?
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, I'm doing well.
Outstanding. You know, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. I followed you as a Facebook friend, and I truly value your post and your knowledge. And I think tonight this is a very interesting conversation to have. With you being a sociologist, I'm just purely a business guy, but I want us to understand, or at least the listening audience, to truly understand the power of this from both sides, from how we take a look at African-American males and as well as how other cultures look at African-American males. But before we go there, tell us a little bit about yourself and what your interests are as it relates to sociology.
Okay, well, I was born and raised in Dallas, Texas primarily, and I attended college at Texas A&M Commerce University. It's basically a mid-sized university about 65 miles east of Dallas that became part of the Texas A&M University system in 1995. After getting my bachelor's and master's degrees in sociology, I moved back to Dallas and was a probation officer for 2.5 years. Decided I didn't like that, and then I went to pursue my doctorate in sociology at Oklahoma State University in Stillwater, Oklahoma. Then after graduating from there, I taught at Xavier University of Louisiana for a year, then at Lamar University in Beaumont for 10 years, then at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette for 2 years, and now I'm at Florida A&M University, where I've been since last fall. Now, my areas of interest in sociology are basically social and racial inequality and crime and deviance.
Okay.
And so basically those are my research interests, like basically do research in the area of African-American student adjustment at predominantly white institutions. And I'm also beginning to conduct research on police use of excessive force against black males. And I'm, beginning to work on a book on that topic, the police use of excessive force against African Americans, understanding its origins and why it persists. So I guess that's me in a nutshell, I guess.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. And, with this topic tonight of, the impact of ethnocentrism on on the development of the African American male, it kind of ties into, your interest of dealing with racial issues, because a lot of that is based in culture.
Yes.
Based on talk. So, if you will, give our listening audience, I guess, a definition of ethnocentrism. I defined it earlier, but I'd like to hear and I'm sure they'd like to hear your definition of ethnocentrism.
Okay, well, I'll give a basic definition. Hopefully, it'll coincide with what your definition was. I didn't get to hear it, your definition, but basically, ethnocentrism refers to the belief that one's cultural standards are basically, or ethnocentrism is the belief that one's own cultural standards are the standards upon which all other cultures must be measured. It's almost like one's own cultural standards represent the status quo or the standard, and so therefore, if one's own cultural standards or cultural practices deviate from that standard or the status quo, they're looked upon, they're viewed as deviant, or having less value.
And that's extremely important in today's society with all that we see going on, especially with police brutality, as well as what's going on with that whole Trump campaign. So let's take a look at it from the impact from the outside, as you talked about cultural standards, and let's take a look at the cultural standards of, I guess, European culture and how they view African American males and the impact. Give us some of your thoughts as it relates to how we are perceived, or how African American males are perceived by Europeans, and let's talk about a little bit of the number of impacts that has on the development of the African American male.
Well, of course, American society is very Eurocentric, and Eurocentrism is basically the standard for U.S. society. And so I feel that, African Americans in general, African American males in particular, are viewed negatively by the society, and therefore we experience negative treatment. Now, of course, I feel this is wrong, but I think it has a lot of, negative impacts on, African Americans and African American males in particular, because I think what it serves to do is to dehumanize us and devalue us, and then desensitize just the society as a whole to, Black death. In other words, I feel that, we're perceived negatively, like as thugs and criminals and non-intellectuals, which is all wrong. And I think those types of, stereotypes also impact us, African-American males, in educational settings, because you look at most public school teachers, approximately, 80 to 85% of public school teachers are white, and most of those are white females. And so, there's a lot of research that shows that those stereotypes impact the type of education that is delivered to, Black students and Black males in particular. And that's significant, I think, because there's research that shows that when African American students are recipients of a proper racial socialization, meaning they're taught positive things about their history and their culture, both African American males and African American females do better in school. And so that whole negative perception has, I think, a very detrimental impact on African Americans and African American males in particular.
Yep. Yeah, I would agree, and I think all who are listening this evening would agree based on life's experiences. And what I want to do to, when we end this conversation later on is walk away with some takeaways, how we can utilize the power of personal development in order to minimize or get others to look at us a little bit differently than how they currently see us. And I know that takes some time, but I like to walk away with solutions to what the challenges are versus just taking a look at the challenges without providing any type of solutions. Now, let's go to African American males, young males. We're talking about the formative years. Let's talk about 5, 6, or 7, because it's interesting how all groups of people, when they see little kids out running around, they talk about how cute they are. But at some point in time, that mindset begins to change, and it goes from being the cute male or female to somewhat of a threat, if you will. Let's talk about those ages of 5 to maybe 8 years old. What can parents do along the lines of raising their kids to kind of minimize that, how ethnocentrism impacts their children when they're in the school system or just out and about in public?
Well, even though, I'm not a psychologist, I'm a sociologist, but, I have, read some of, social, psychological, and psychological literature. I think that one of the things, well, first of all, let me say this. First of all, psychological research primarily says that young people become aware of the differences and stereotypes regarding different races around the ages of 4 and 5. And then I've, come across some recent psychological research that, and I think a lot of people have heard of this recent study that demonstrated that when it comes to African American males, they are less likely to be viewed as innocent, and they're perceived as older than their actual age. And so African American males don't receive the same, they don't have the same perception of being a child as white males do. And so, you look at the tragic case of Tamir Rice, some of the things officers said was that he seemed older than what he was. And so, those types of benefits of childhood we don't get to receive. I mean, our children don't get to receive. But I think that what parents can do, and, just being a parent myself and then talking to other parents, oftentimes parents don't like to do this. But I think research shows as well that it's imperative that parents do this, is to make their children aware of race. We have to have that talk with, our children in terms of what the world is like, how the world's going to perceive them, what to expect, not only to help, just kind of maintain their safety, but also psychologically. There's research that shows that it's psychologically more damaging for a black child to, be raised believing that race doesn't really matter. It's more damaging when they're raised to believe that it doesn't matter. And then, say, for instance, by the time they enter college, in which there's a lot of research on, racism on college campuses as being a big problem, that it's more detrimental to them then when they've been taught that, we live in a colorblind society and race is an issue, when they actually find out it is an issue. So I think that, we need to, first as parents, educate ourselves and then educate our children about their value and their history so that they can have a sort of, psychic armor to deal with what they're going to experience in the real world.
Okay. Now, as it relates to you're working at several different universities over your career. How do you see the African American culture standards and view of itself impact African American males? How does ethnocentrism impact us internally as far as what our culture is and what our standards are? What do you see? How does it impact them, and what differences do you see between other cultures?
Okay, well, I can speak to that. I think that my research interests, particularly the academic success and social adjustment of black students at predominantly white colleges, and just in my dealings with students, my interactions with students, has shown me that African American students in general, then African American males, experience a lot of ethnocentrism in these college settings, particularly when I would interview African American males, because most of my research centered on African American males and their academic success and social adjustment at predominantly white institutions. They would reveal to me in the interviews how they were basically made to feel like second-class citizens in the classroom because, they didn't feel as though their professors really cared. They didn't believe that, the accomplishments of African Americans are positive things about African American culture. Well, I'll say African and African American culture were ever infused in the classroom. They also felt as though the only time they were even encouraged to participate in classroom discussions was when a topic on African Americans came up, particularly in a negative light, like something like crime or poverty or something of that nature. So from what I got is that it impacted them negatively, the ethnocentrism that they received. Now, I didn't really get a chance to, I interacted with other students, non-African American students, just in the classroom, but they rarely, would come to meet with me at my office and express, their own, personal experiences. But, research does show that these same settings, these predominantly white institutional settings, produce positive experiences for white students. So you would assume that not being victimized by ethnocentrism, in the sense that their accomplishments, the accomplishments of whites and, having the classroom assignments and lessons and discussions showing whites primarily in a positive light, that seems to have a positive impact on them as a whole.
How does the impact play out on the collective of the African American male here in the U.S.? Oftentimes, you hear two different versions. You hear we are our own worst enemy, and then oftentimes you hear other people being the perpetrators of what's really and truly going on with African Americans, meaning that we being victimized. So how does that impact the collective of the African Americans or African American males being viewed from a negative light? And again, the question is, what can we do to minimize that impact?
Well, okay. Well, let me speak to it from my experiences with African American males in collegiate settings. I think that, and it's been my experience when I've taught at historically black colleges, it seems to me that you have I've experienced at least two different types of African American students, African American males, and now that I think about it, my research in general corroborates this, is that the African American male students who attend as a collective, that attend historically black colleges and universities, tend to embrace black culture more in a positive sense. So, the ethnocentrism doesn't really impact them as much because they're not going to experience it as much at a historically black college because, they're able to take classes on, African American studies, African American history courses, and particularly at, Florida A&M, every student has to take an African American history course. And I could say this, when I taught, well, at least at one of the predominantly white institutions I taught at, there were no any type of African American history courses or any African American studies courses. As a matter of fact, at one of the predominantly white institutions that I taught at, I created a class called Sociology of the African American Experience, and I created the course. And as soon as I left, just talking to some of the former students, some of my former students who went there, it was no longer taught, so there were no classes taught. So I think that it's a more positive experience, and for African American students at historically black colleges and universities, and parents should consider them for their children. And then also another thing that I'm sure you've heard, and I'm not the first to say this, but I think a way that we can combat, the issue of ethnocentrism and how it impacts our children is by building our own economy. I know that at the very beginning of this interview you said that you're a businessman, and I think that's one way in which we can insulate ourselves, build our own economy, and so that we can possibly fund our own schools, have more, control over the institutions that our children, when I'm talking about like educational institutions, so that they will be able to learn positive information about African Americans, African American culture, and the African American experience, which will serve to limit the problems that a lot of our children have today. And I think that's something that, as a whole, we as a community, as a collective, don't think about enough, the importance of developing our own economy. Because by doing that, we can have more control over the institutions and how they impact our children.
I agree with you 100%. I've been preaching that message for some years about the importance of building a self-sustainable economy where we can dictate our own destiny, if you will. Source Nation, if you're just tuning in, you're listening to Personal Development. It's your time with me, Dr. Terry Jackson, your host. Our special guest is Dr. Rowman Robertson. He's a professor of sociology at Florida A&M University, and we are discussing the impact of ethnocentrism on the development of the African-American male. Let's just shift the conversation a little bit, because you talked about your research interest, and you also talked about, a book that you are seeking to, or you're in the process of writing. Tell us a little bit more about that, and then let's tie in some personal development along with the ethnocentrism into this piece of the conversation.
Okay, well, the book, as I mentioned earlier, is titled "Police Use of Excessive Force Against African Americans: Understanding Its Origins and Why It Persists." I think it's something that is needed because for a lot of us, and I'm talking about for a lot of us as African Americans, we know that excessive force by police has been a problem. But when I talk with people, well, African Americans and non-African Americans, many of them, have the idea that it's a recent phenomenon. And, what I tell them is that, no, it's not a recent phenomenon. Just now, we just have more technology, so we're able to capture when it occurs more frequently. So it gives us the appearance that it's just now a problem, but it's always been a problem going back to, some of the first police officers, with the slave patrol, the slave overseer. So it's always been a problem. And just the fact that you were talking about how ethnocentrism impacts this, well, you have to think of, research shows that typical police recruit is a young white male with some college who tends to be from a working class background and is more or less relatively conservative or, conservative in, their political outlook. So when you think of that type of person who already doesn't have a very positive view of African Americans, and even though research shows this, that research shows that not only police officers but white people as a collective are more likely to view black people as deserving of the treatment that we receive by police, and then we are criminally prone or predisposed to criminal behavior. Now, all of that is nonsense, of course, but that's what a lot of whites believe. So ethnocentrism infused into the educational process and into society at large really impacts those ideas, and it serves to desensitize not only whites but also many African Americans to black death, particularly at the hands of police. So that's unfortunate also. So I think that, eradicating ethnocentrism and then somehow being able to educate our children will also help them not only know what to expect, but also to help them to, and I hate to say this, just try to navigate this terrain out here, because I don't want to get into the notion that we have to be more respectful or anything like that. I don't want to do that because, history shows that even during the lynching period, oftentimes black men in suits would get lynched. So I don't really subscribe to respectability politics, but I do think that, if we take our time as a collective, because I don't expect, the larger society to do it, but to educate our children, educate our children, socialize them in a way that will imbue them with a positive cultural consciousness, will go a long way in helping them navigate the terrain of America, and also navigate those situations in which, they have to deal with police. So at least we can stay alive.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I think you hit the nail on the head earlier when you talked about building our own economy so that we can pretty much control everything within our culture, because that would allow you to do so by building your own economy, becoming self-sustaining or as self-sustaining as possible. It will allow you to be able to control those levers within your community or your culture, and prevent that outside attack, if you will. I had somewhat of an epiphany here, and I want you to correct me if I'm wrong, but I just equated ethnocentrism to double standards. Am I correct in that equation?
Oh, okay. Yeah, but I was listening to hear how you were going to, were you going to expound upon that in terms of like a specific example, in terms of, like, say, for instance, I don't know, in a situation in which police encounter a young white male, they will give that young white male the benefit of the doubt, will reason with him, talk with him, as opposed to a situation like that happened with Tamir Rice. I mean, they just pulled up and shot him, didn't ask a question or anything. Yeah, I think that it is a double standard, if that's what you are.
Yeah, exactly. I'm looking at the situation that happened in Oregon the other week, where the FBI and law enforcement, they let those guys out on the land, and they were able to stay there for a period of time, and they didn't really gather up all the forces and go take it over and go in with the guns blazing. They were more patient, with them. Versus, let's take a look at, 1980. Well, let's take a look at other situations where, guns are blazing. All we got to do is think about the Panthers and Fred Hampton. He's in his house asleep in the middle of in the early morning, and they bust in and they just begin to fire and kill him. And another officer shoots him in the head. And it's just, the double standard of how they treat us versus how they treat themselves, out on the streets. I mean, all we have to do is kind of take a look at the sentencing guidelines, prior to Obama, what Clinton kind of laid out, with powder versus crack cocaine and the different sentencing guidelines. And so that's, based on their culture, because they use cocaine is cocaine, but because they use powder versus crack cocaine, then it was a different way of sentencing us versus them.
Yeah, and I think that I believe it was Neely Fuller. I'm not exactly certain, but I believe it was Neely Fuller who, and I'm paraphrasing here, said, until you understand racism and white supremacy, everything else will confuse you. And I believe that because, of course, double standards are wrong and they shouldn't exist. But we live in a society, well, I should only say a society, a world, in which racism and white supremacy is the standard. So, I don't foresee us ever getting that. I don't foresee that double standard going away just based on whites having some sort of epiphany and saying, "Hey, we're treating people improperly. Let's just be totally fair." I just don't see that happening, because unless racism and white supremacy can be eradicated, and I think the only way that we can hope to eradicate it or limit its impact is for us, as we've been mentioning throughout this broadcast or this radio interview, is to develop our own economy, control our institutions, so that we can insulate ourselves from some of these things. But I think, like I said, as long as racism and white supremacy remain the norm, those types of double standards will always exist. So
now let's switch up a little bit, and let's take a look at maybe even Asian culture. Let's take a look at how ethnocentrism impacts the African American male from the Asian culture, because it appears as though they don't have, or they don't go through what, and they are considered a minority, but they don't go through what African American males go through as it relates to ethnocentrism. If you can speak to that.
Well, I think, and there's research that shows this, and I'm not the first person to mention this, but for one, even though Asian, under the category of Asian, you have a lot of different ethnic groups. You have Chinese Americans, Filipino Americans, Japanese Americans. I think, to at least in a collective sense, all of those groups have, or at least, when I'm speaking of, I guess, Arab Americans, who are also included under Asian, East Indians, Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, at least within those groups, because, research shows that your Southeast Asians, like your Vietnamese, your Laotians, your Cambodians, are not, doing as well collectively, and actually their median household incomes, levels of educational attainment, and levels of poverty are closer to those of African Americans and Latinos. But the other groups the other Asian groups that are doing more successful, they have a, I guess you could say, cultural consciousness among their specific groups, which allows them to, pool their resources, develop their own economy, and then they can do those things that insulate themselves from some of the negative impacts of ethnocentrism. And like I said before, I'm not the first one to mention this, but that's why you rarely hear about Asian Americans, getting shot by the police under mysterious circumstances. You rarely hear of an Asian American leader or anything like that, because they control their own economy. So in that sense, and then also I think a thing, and I'm not the first person to have brought this up, but at least among those specific Asian groups, they have an agenda. And in other words, African Americans as a group, we don't have a quote unquote black agenda. So that, like a code of conduct of sorts, to where we say, hey, as an African American, no matter what you believe as an individual, these are the collective things we are for, and these are the collective things that we are against. And we can also use that agenda to leverage, along with our own economy, for more political power. And I think that's what Asian Americans do. And so a lot of the things that we experience, they don't really experience.
So they know when they come here what the goals and objectives are, what the strategy is, pretty much what the vision is, and they adhere to a certain behavior because that's expected of them, or they're taught when they come here.
Yeah, I mean, now I haven't done a lot of research or read a lot of research on Asian Americans, but what I have read, has informed me that they do have more of a collective cultural consciousness, at least among specific Asian groups, the more successful ones, which makes it easier to become successful because with that collective cultural consciousness among those specific Asian groups, they're able to pool their resources to help each other start businesses and then support those businesses. And unfortunately, with African Americans, we tend to spend a lot of money, but we don't use any of that, I guess you could say, disposable income to start our own businesses and support the black businesses that we have, or even develop a code of conduct so that we can, have more strength collectively. In many ways, it's almost like it's every man for himself, and every man and woman to himself or herself. It seems like that to me sometimes.
Yeah, I would agree with you 100%. And I think it also goes back to this. Based on other cultures, other groups of people, it appears to me that they all do one thing and they have one thing in common, and that is they always go to their elders for advice, versus when I look at a great deal of what we do, a lot of our youth don't have the same level of respect for the elder as other cultures have. So we've kind of gotten away from that, and I don't know if you agree with that or not, but that's something that I kind of see that really has us in a tizzy, if you will.
You know what? It's interesting you said that, because I do agree with that, but I also look at this aspect as well. Because, when I talk with people and when I just think about the question you brought up myself, because I've thought about it a lot, one of the things that we don't look at as a community is how these children, how we could have failed them. And what I mean by that is, there's a lot of research, criminological research, that shows, when young people have more positive, opportunities or options, they're less likely to get involved in those behaviors that are deviant. In other words, if we had our own economy, we could provide our own children jobs. If we had more of a code of conduct, perhaps even if, of course I'd like all black families to stay together, but if they didn't stay together, there would be more people who would take up the role of a father for those young men who don't have fathers in the home. And so when you see in some of those other communities, when they have their own economies, they have those types of things. And I think, and then also with talking with young African-American males, because a large portion of my life I've worked with, organizations that have dealt with, serving like big brothers or mentors, African-American males. And oftentimes when you talk with them about why do they get involved in, certain types of behaviors, they'll often say things like, okay, what other options are there out there? I've had some say to me before, well, could you give me a job? And, as opposed to having something positive for them to do other than, maybe some of the not so positive things. And, and when I was asked those questions, what could I say? Well, no, I couldn't. And then for us as a community, as a collective community, we weren't able to do that. So I think some of them, just from talking with them and, reading some of the literature out there, is that to a large extent, they view that we have failed them. We didn't leave anything for them, and I think that a lot of us, particularly people my age, I'm 45 and older, we don't necessarily look at that part of the equation. Oftentimes we'll say things, and I've said this myself at times, that, oh, I don't know what's wrong with these young people of today, and we never look at, well, we raised them. Where did we go wrong? Did we not give them that positive racial socialization, or what did we not provide an economy for them, so whether they could have jobs or things that are positive to do that would limit the likelihood of getting involved in negative things. So I think that's something that we don't look at. So honestly, I think that young people could do better, but I also think that to some extent we failed them as well, and I include myself in that failure.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. And often when I speak with young African Americans, that's one of the first things that I say is that we failed you because we haven't built any institutions to educate you or to provide you with any type of employment. We raise you and we ask the question, what's wrong? But we are what's wrong. And that's consistent with another comment that I make, and that is I often hear people say, our youth and our children are the future. But it's actually the adult that is the future, because it is the adult, based on what they do or don't do, that will dictate the future of the generations to come. And we have done a poor job of that. And so I'm in agreement with you 100%. I know time is drawing near now for us to end the show, but I'd like to be able to just ask you if there was 3 pieces of advice that you could give, not only for youth who are listening, but for adults who are listening, as to what we can do in order to make the situation better at present for us, but in the future for the youth. What would you give us?
Oh, well, that's kind of, because a million things are going through my head right now. But and I think, well, I'll come up with 3 things, and I think this will help us to empower ourselves. First, learn more about our history, and I'm not saying that just learning history for history's sake, but just learning history so that we can have a foundation for knowing, the things that we did good, but also where we went wrong, so that we can improve upon not only the good things that our ancestors did, but also the not so good things that our ancestors did. So learn our history. Secondly, embrace our youth. In other words, embrace our youth encompasses not only teaching them that history, and but also listening to them. I mean, embracing them. Not only teaching the history, but also embracing them, being there for them. Because current research shows that 7 out of 10 African American, children are born out of wedlock, and that's not to say that all of those children won't have fathers in their lives. But for those who don't, we need to embrace them and try to fulfill that role as much as possible. So study our history, embrace our children, and then finally work to build our own economy and a accompanying Black agenda. Because until we build our own economy and a Black agenda or code of conduct, I don't think we'll ever be able to move forward, because we have to be on the same page about something. I mean, because of course everyone's not going to have the same beliefs on everything, but there should be some type of things that we will do and we won't do, because, and I'm sure you see this as well, when other African American people want to quote unquote sell us out, there's no penalty for them. I mean, I'm sure when they do that type of thing, they probably say, well, heck, I can make more money and live a better life selling my people out than, trying to fight the fight that we need to fight. So I think that those three things would be some good starting points. Well, of course, I just, came up with that right quickly. So maybe if I put more thought into it, I could come up with some better things. But I think those three things would be a good starting point anyway.
Yeah. Well, I thank you so very much for those 3 points, and I'm sure the listeners appreciate them, and hopefully the listeners would take those to heart and begin to act on at least developing a code of conduct, if you will. I want to thank you very much for taking the time out of your Sunday evening to be a part of our show here. As I say, I follow you on Facebook. I'm always enjoying your posts, and it's just a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with you this evening.
Oh, okay. Well, it was a pleasure for me to be here, and if you ever want to have me on again, I will be more than happy to do so.
And I look forward to that, and we will definitely have you on in the future. So thank you so very much again.
Okay, well, thank you. I appreciate it.
All right. Have a great one.
Okay, you too.
So, Edition, before I leave, I want to thank our sponsors once again, and they are Scott Cares Foundation, Meet My Types Matchmaking, Urban Grandstand Digital, Cat Photography, Hits Masters, New Covenant of Praise Worship Center, and PS Photography. Source Nation, until next week, just speak again. Thank you.